Proverbs 18:17 says, "The one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him." I want to talk about how the gospel and how Jesus fulfill the role as sort of the ultimate cross-examiner. So this is going to be titled, "When the Man Comes Around." I want to focus on the word "until" in that passage. I want to suggest that biblically speaking, the word "until" is an assertion of absolute certainty. The cross-examiner will come. The cross-examiner will come. The great final cross-examination is coming. That's what the Bible means when it speaks of the judgment of God or the apocalypse. One of the last songs that Johnny Cash wrote before he died was called "When the Man Comes Around," and you should definitely check it out. It's a great song. And also "Hurt" is on the same album, which is also wonderful. But he's talking about that final cross-examination when the man, Jesus, comes around. And when Christ is finished with this future cross-examination, all truth will be revealed and it will be agreed upon, including all ultimate truth, the ultimate truth. Every knee, the Bible says, will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. So for now, we have all these different tricks. We can change the subject like the woman at the well did, or we can question the nature of truth itself like Pontius Pilate, or we can blame others, or we can fly into a rage like the Sanhedrin, or we can use moral outrage like Judas, or we can be false victims like the Ephesian silversmiths. But one day, total, perfect, complete judgment will happen. And that's what the word apocalypse means. It means the unveiling, the laying bare, the truth being revealed. And every man and woman one day will stand before their Maker and be cross-examined. 1 Corinthians 1:13 says that each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire. And the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. I think you could say that this has already begun in some respects. When Jesus came, he initiated a new set of kingdom ethics. Well, they weren't new, but he was clarifying, and he kept saying over and over again, "You've heard it said." So, for instance, in Matthew 7:21, he says, "You've heard it said, you shall not murder. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire." And then, right down in verse 27, he says again, "You've heard it said that you've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." And then again in verse 31, "It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." In verse 33, "Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king." So over and over again, you've heard that it was said, this cross-examination of kingdom ethics. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. This is Jesus already beginning a process of cross-examining the received wisdom of the world, the collective wisdom of the world. In verse 43, he says, "You've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain and the just on the just and the unjust." So there's this sense in which Jesus is already introducing, you've heard it this way, but I'm setting the record straight. But there's another way, and that's just that salvation itself is a cross-examination. Jesus has already begun working this judgment in the household of faith. And I'm going to look more at that verse in 1 Peter in a minute. But, we just celebrated the resurrection and the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. And that's essentially Jesus shaming the false wisdom of the world, right? Like, there's a sense in which the cross is cross-examination. There's a sense in which Jesus is showing what true power and true wisdom is in the face of a false narrative provided by the world. And through the resurrection of Jesus, God has shown death to have far worse bark than bite. Jesus is cross-examining death in the resurrection. He's saying, well, grave, where is your victory? Well, death, where is your sting? But even in saving a person, Jesus is sort of fulfilling this cross-examining role. The Bible says there's a way that seems right to a man, but in the end leads to death. And then it says that Jesus came to those people and he preached peace to those who were near and to those who were far off. And through this effectual call, Jesus says, come now, let us reason together. Jesus is like setting the record straight. He's going to the fool and he's saying, hey, there's a different way. This is all pictured in a respect in Jesus' cross-examination in salvation is pictured in Zechariah. So let me just read chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. Then he showed me Joshua, the high priest, standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And the Lord said to Satan, the Lord rebuke you, O Satan. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this a brand plucked from the fire? Now Joshua was standing before the angel, clothed with filthy garments. And the angel said to those who were standing before him, remove the filthy garments from him. And to him he said, behold, I have taken away your iniquity away from you, and I will clothe you with pure vestments. And I said, let them put a clean turban on his head. So they put a clean turban on his head and clothed him with garments. And the angel of the Lord was standing by. This is like crazy interesting to me. But I'll record a different video about that second role of the person who said, Zechariah, who said, let there be a turban on his head. There's another way in which sanctification is cross-examination. That's the whole idea in some respects. If Jesus is making us more like him, he's having to speak against our false perceptions. He's having to remove the errors and replace with the truth. So Revelation 3, right? Jesus says, I know your works. You are neither hot nor cold. Would that you were either cold or hot. So because you are lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. For you say, I am rich, I have prospered, and I need nothing, not realizing that you are wretched, and pitiable, and poor, and blind, and naked. I counsel you to buy from me gold refined by fire, so that you may be rich in white garments, so that you may clothe yourself, and the shame of your nakedness may not be seen, and salve to anoint your eyes, so that you may see. Those whom I love I reprove and discipline, so be zealous and repent. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and eat with him, and he with me. The one who conquers, I will grant him to sit with me on the throne, as I also conquered and sat down with my Father on his throne. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. So Jesus is setting the record straight, right? He's saying, you think this, but here's the reality of where you are. And that's what sanctification is. There's also a sense in which Jesus uses suffering as a means of self-examination. There's a sense in which the storms of life cross-examine our hearts, right? So Matthew 7:24 says, everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. So the storm comes and cross-examines this faithful person, and it doesn't succeed in showing any error. But then, verse 26, and everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand, and the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. So, the storm cross-examines. Parable of the soils in Matthew 13 is another example of this. Hear then the parable of the the sower. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what has been sown in his heart. This is what was sown along the path. As for what was sown on the rocky ground, this is the one who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, and yet he has no root in in himself, but endures for a while, and when tribulation or persecution arise on account of the word, immediately he falls away. As for what was sown among the thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. As for what was sown on good soil, this is the one who hears the word and understands it, and he indeed bears fruit and yields, in one case 100-fold, in another 60, and another 30. So Jesus is using this as a way of saying, let's cross-examine real belief. Let's see what really happens when we allow thorns or birds or whatever into the scene. So Peter, in chapter 4 of his first epistle, he actually says explicitly, judgment begins in the household of faith, or in the household of faith. So look at verse 12 of that. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God, and if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? Verse 18, and if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. I think it's really important that we get a little more real about suffering with the approach of Christ. Remember, there was a period of time in Jesus's, there was always a moment like throughout Jesus's life when he looked like a fool. It was scattered for most of his life. But there were places like where, for instance, his family thought he was crazy, right? But all of that reproach gets concentrated at the cross. And there the scoffers just ran, unchecked. And their point, unilaterally, like very different kinds of people, study that passage, very different kinds of people, but they all are scoffing in the same way. You trusted God, and you are a fool for it. And his vindication, he had to just endure all that. His vindication couldn't come by being delivered from the cross. He had to endure that suffering until the work that was set to be accomplished was accomplished. He had to endure that, and then by enduring it, he had to allow his vindication to come from resurrection. And this is exactly where we find ourselves in this idea of leaning into that word until in Proverbs 18:17. The word until is sort of like until God comes and sets things straight. Until God comes and sets things straight. That's our whole life has to be leaning into that truth. If we're Christ followers, it has to be that way. There's a phrase that MLK used years ago that he borrowed. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Let me read the whole quote it was from an abolitionist pastor in 1853. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eye reaches but little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by experience of sight. I can divine it by conscience, and from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice. The one who states his case seems right. The one who states his case first seems right until another comes and cross-examines him. So much of our lives doesn't make sense unless there is a final act of vindication by Jesus, the man who comes around. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that if there is no resurrection, if there is no vindication, on the other side of the suffering, then we are to be amongst all people most pitied. So we're going to talk in the next video, which I'll post on Monday, about how this verse, Proverbs 18:17, helps us to be good thinkers. It also helps us to know how to deal with gossip and slander and so many other issues. And I think it'll actually help us to think through where we are with COVID. So I'm going to do some additional work. I've been meditating on this verse for several weeks now and just have a ton to share. I'm not exactly sure how to get all of this out or if anyone even wants to know, but point one of this verse is that word until is a promise. It's a promise. Until the man comes around. I don't know how the moral universe works exactly, but I know that it is a long arc that bends toward justice. Jesus will set all things right. Praise God. So now let's go ahead and talk about some application from what we've discussed up to this point. I want to take you back to the passage in Zechariah chapter 3. I said I would record a different video about this, but I can just record this video. I can just do it here. In Zechariah chapter 3, two things really jump out at me for application. Firstly, every one of us is on trial. Every one of us is in some respects weighing our worth, the goodness of our actions, the badness of our actions. Like there's just this sense in which there is an ongoing drama, crime drama unfolding, an ongoing court procedural that I watch. So there's this sense in which just make sure that when you are looking at your own trial, and Satan's accusing you and Jesus is defending you, like it says in Zechariah 3, just make sure that you actually listen to Jesus. Just make sure you actually listen to what Jesus is saying. You're going to have to decide, is what he's saying right? Is what he's saying true? I've had to have moments before I got up to preach where it's like, okay, do I believe the gospel is for me? Do I believe that I am in Christ and that his righteousness is imputed to me? And that if I didn't believe that, I couldn't have gotten up and preached. I couldn't have. I just felt so thin spiritually, so unworthy that there's no way I could get up there and talk about God if I didn't believe what Jesus says in his cross-examination. But there's another piece of that passage in Zechariah 3 that I just find so interesting and very convicting and helpful. And that is that, Zechariah is kind of witnessing this. It's his vision, right? But in a way, I kind of imagine Zechariah in the gallery. Is that the right word? In the courtroom. He's sitting in the seats in the audience, and that's very interesting because we have people in our lives that are kind of watching our trial unfold, and everybody in our lives is going to either take the side of the defense of Jesus or take the side of the prosecution of Satan. Like everybody in our lives is going to decide whether they're going to cheer for the devil or cheer for Jesus. And what I love about that in that Zechariah 3 moment is that Zechariah jumps up out of the gallery as Jesus is presenting his cross-examination, and Jesus is saying, "No, this is my chosen one. I have pulled him out of the fire, put a clean robe on him," and Zechariah is so pulling for Joshua's renewal and restoration and healing that he jumps up and says, "Give him a clean turban too." He's totally on the side of team forgiveness, team grace, team restoration. And man, I'm not sure how often I've been that for people. And I want to make sure that I am that for people. I want to make sure that I'm always the guy on the side of, yes, you can be forgiven. Yes, you can be restored. Yes, like I'm believing everything Jesus is saying about you. I think there's just a temptation that has to do with pride and just indwelling sin and hurt and so forth. There's a temptation to look at people, even the people that we love, and to say, well, I think that Satan's probably more right about you than Jesus is. So I think that's a very important point to make. The second thing I wanted to think about as it relates to application is just what the cross-examination we see in Revelation chapter 3 with the church in Laodicea. There's just this really helpful assurance that comes from walking with God that makes you think, if I'm wrong, he loves me enough to tell me. And I think the most destructive, fearful kind of thing for me has always been, what if I'm wrong and I don't know it? What if I'm self-deceived? What if I'm just totally wrong? And there's just this encouragement in that hard passage where Jesus goes to them and says, you're wrong. You think you're this, but you're not. You think you're that, but you're not. And he's doing that because he loves them. It says, those whom I love, I reprove and discipline. And I just think there's just this this sense of, I hope that we all have the intellectual humility that says, man, I don't know. I don't know for sure sometimes whether I'm right or not. And I don't know if my perceptions of self are trustworthy and so on and so forth. Basically, I hope we're all intellectually humble enough to have category for being self-deceived. And then you kind of, that's good. It's a good thing to have. But then you begin to wonder, well, maybe it's all crap. Maybe I'm just entirely wrong. It's like, well, hopefully you believe that Jesus has saved you, and that that if he has saved you, then he will come to you and he will tell you when you're wrong. And he will address those things. Psalm 139, I'm going to read a couple verses from the beginning and then the end. Psalm 139 is the classic sort of, tell me when I'm wrong, Lord. Verse 1 of Psalm 139, to the choir master, a psalm of David, O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down, and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it all together. And then he ends with, search me, O God, verse 23. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me, and know my thoughts. And see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. So I think the thing that maybe we should just say at this point is how would Jesus tell you you were wrong? And that was kind of what I was getting at when I started talking about the storms and the soils and so forth, suffering. I think the way that Jesus would typically tell us we were wrong is by showing us, after a storm, what's left. Is mostly just what's left. I think he could show us where we were wrong by showing us how we react when threatened by the reproach of the world, maybe not even experiencing the reproach of the world, but simply threatened by it. Well, maybe he shows us in that way as well. So this question of how would Jesus tell us we were wrong? Well, he might send a storm into our life, and we would be able to see at the end of that what's left. He might send threatenings of reproach. What would you do if tomorrow your neighbor thought you were a part of some extreme cult that, was like on par with, Islamic terrorism? What would you do if you got called a bigot and a homophobe and so on and so forth? Those aren't necessarily hypothetical questions. That's where things seem to be headed. You probably need to make peace with being considered a weirdo, and maybe worse than a weirdo. So how do you respond when the reproach of Christ is threatening to glom onto you?
What do you do after? What do you do with the word that you have? You know, what do you? How are you responding to the word that you do have? That might be one way that Jesus is showing you where you're at. The last point is that I just want you to see that Satan always wants to have the last word, but he doesn't get it. You know, Peter writing, everything Peter says is just so rich to me because his betrayal and his failures are so real to me. And there's that moment where Peter is with Jesus right before Jesus is arrested. And Jesus says, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. Well, that's just another way of talking about cross-examination, you know. It's the Job thing, right? It's the Satan wants to be able to show like you're a fraud. And Jesus says, but I have prayed for you. And after you are restored, seek out your brothers. Jesus always gets the last word with his children. He always gets the cross-examination. He is the Alpha and the Omega. He is the last word.